All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. And today we're talking about money manners. We've talked about money as a concept before. This idea actually came from a friend of my son's who came to his birthday party on Sunday evening, and he was telling us some really fascinating things about how he would get in trouble with his parents if he came to the party and didn't have money with him to cover certain kinds of things, because one should not let other people treat one to something under certain conditions. And anyway, I was like, I totally have to bring that up at Dive into World Building, because these are things that are deeply culturally important. Who gets to pay for whom and how and when, and it's what does it mean? Because it means something.
Wait. So this week is dive into check grabbing.
Yes. and people do. They dive into check grabbing.
I have a story. When we get to stories.
You guys can feel free to still, pay my check anytime you want. Dive right.
So do you want?
So why don't you go for your story, Morgan?
Okay, so this is it happened to be Passover, and I had lost track of when Passover was. So found myself with my kids at a convention for first night, I think it was first night. So a bunch of friends from the con, maybe a third of us Jewish,
okay,
and the rest, interested. And we found ourselves in an Indian restaurant. And there were two of the people there were single guys, well employed, basically really, really nice guys. So there they are. There are 11 or 12 of us, and they are trying to figure out which one of them is going to pay the check. And they are just chattering back and forth and discussing it. No me. So finally, one of them says, basically, look over there. And the other one looks, and the guy who said that reaches over his shoulder across the half wall and hands his credit card and the check to the waitress. And so when the other guy looks back, it's like, it's all over. And the guy who won just has this look on his face like, it's done. I'm good. I got it. But it was interesting watching them do that. I'm going to get it. This Indian restaurant for 12 people.
But, okay. So I hear you saying this as if this is an odd thing. And
well, it was to me.
Right. Which is why I want to kind of, as long as we're starting this way, it's an infamous thing. And one of them is that in some of the East Asian cultures, and I think also for South Asians, there's a thing where grabbing the check is status, and it's like a potlatch, right? It's I can afford to do this, and so there is a certain competition.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on a second. Sorry, I don't know if you guys picked up what my kid was saying, but I hope not.
I didn't hear it, so that's cool.
Good. But as a result, it is a sign of you've. It's infantilization to be paid for.
Okay.
I mean, that's exaggerating it several orders of magnitude. But so as a result, people do fight for the check, and so most of my ABC, my Chinese American friends, all have stories about watching the uncles fight for the check.
Oh, that's interesting.
And the games that happen where there's the, no, look at this dodge, which none of them would fall for because they're on the lookout for this. There's the slipping the credit card to the the waiter station
Yeah.
before the check even arrives game.
Yeah.
There's there's the already having your card in your hand, but you can't be waving it around because that's crass. So
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
using
Can't
the
wave it around.
using the card concealment techniques to sort of have it in your hand so that when they bring the check to you, but then it's a question of who grabs the binder with the check first. And there's stories about people leaping across the table to wrestle it from each other. I mean, there are these epic stories. If you look this up, there are many, many people who've written up these stories because they are hilarious. And also because most of us who are writing these stories we're not of the generation to be grabbing the check when we were writing these stories. These are the funny stories we told about our dads and our uncles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or grandpa and his brother kind of stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so these are very, very classic within certain cultures. And I don't think it's just East Asians. I think that I've seen Jewish families do this. I've seen Greek families do this, and I don't know how universal it is in any of those families, but definitely there's a whole thing about who gets to dive for it. I find the
Yeah.
other end of the equation much more interesting is the how do you tell your friends when they want to go out and have foie gras and $20 cocktails that you love their company, but that's just not going to happen.
It's I never figured that out, and as a result,
You just don't go.
it's either that or spend money I don't really have. So
Yeah.
I have the relative privilege of being very, very loud about my precarity.
I just flat out like I can't afford it, but then people are like, I mean, I lack filter probably.
Well, there are a lot of rules around how we're supposed to talk about money.
Yes.
You're supposed to be very careful about how you talk about money. And I think it has to do with the status issue, right? It wouldn't be so fraught if having money wasn't associated with being powerful and having, various things going on.
There's also these strange myths that happen where like I was on a panel about precarity or not I sorry. I was sitting in the audience for a panel about poverty at a convention, and the things that the non-impoverished panelists were saying about their beliefs about the enculturation of poor people was really fascinating.
Yeah.
And really, as somebody pointed out, I think it might have been Cliff at some point recently, was pointing out that these are the things that happen when the middle class is wanting to not talk about money, because if you're aspirational, discussing money reveals that you're not as affluent as you're pretending to be.
Yeah.
But below a certain level, there's no point to the pretense.
Yeah.
And so, right, that no filter thing comes into play.
Yeah.
But
Sure.
yeah, I've often flat out said, and I have various friends who said, oh, come to dinner, I'll pay. And then the awkward thing is when they have had too many drinks and they forget.
yeah.
Oh dear.
Yeah. I do not have an answer for that one.
Yeah, I don't either. It is interesting. And you always want to try to figure out the conditions in advance because you don't want to have to negotiate them when the check has arrived, right?
So awkward.
Yeah, right.
So awkward. But
so asking about it in advance is definitely a part of the good manners about money, right?
Yeah. But we don't encourage it. We don't teach it. I
Well,
have
think
read
and following through when you've promised to pay for something.
It's really amazing how many people fail to do that.
Yeah.
Also, I've watched people sort of promise to pay for a thing when they know that a friend is suffering and their kid needs something.
Mm.
And some people really manage to be good about it, and some people forget. And that becomes a problem because then everybody else who might have said yes has already gone away.
Yeah.
So there are some interesting rules that we don't follow about how these things should be handled. And I because I read too much Emily Post and Miss Manners as a child, I know what
But you have to
stationery.
because they're fun.
I
So
know what stationery and what time interval and the wording to accept a weekend invitation to go boating in the Hamptons, but not how to say, hey, this is a thing that I could use help with. It's funny.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so every so often you'll see people talking about need on the internet. And GoFundMe is now a thing. And boy, that gets complicated, right? So but generally speaking, people are very embarrassed to talk about need and ask other people for help.
There's a bunch of shaming that goes on.
Yeah.
And also there's a whole, I mean, today in the news, we're having all this conversation about food stamps, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so one of the other things that goes into this is money conversations, what's considered a personal conversation. Because in some cultures, you're allowed to ask flat out, what do you make? And in this one, we have to fight very hard against that. And it's a social justice issue. This is how we discover that men are getting paid better than women.
Right.
And there's also the issue of what people are allowed to display if they have declared that they are living financially precariously. There are certain performances that are expected.
Yes. And also, I would say that there is this idea that if you are financially supporting someone, that they have to behave to your standards, that there's a sort of a money control sort of underlayer to a lot of this conversation.
And that really goes into why a lot of people won't take money favors.
Right.
Because the strings are often hard.
One of the things that is not supposed to be displayed if you are on public assistance of any form is a cell phone.
Right.
Cell phones are not luxuries, but a lot of people who have money and who actually have the wherewithal for a smartphone and a smartphone plan treat it like a luxury. And I'm wondering if they recognized that it was not a luxury, that it was just something that people need to have at this point is a cell phone, that would lessen the divide that they are seeing, and that they don't want that they want to be, if you have a cell phone and it's a luxury, then you can be perceived as being moneyed to some extent. If it's a luxury. If it's not, then you are just an ordinary person who has a cell phone, and you can't wave it around and say, look, I have money.
Well, so I think there are two things going on here. One is the question of whether a cell phone is actually a luxury or a necessity, right?
Yeah.
And the other one is why somebody would want to have obvious signs of being well off, right? Because if you're not well off, you can be heavily discriminated against on the basis of that, right? And so you might want to have one or two really important things that you have about you as signs of being financially okay that you need for particular types of situations where you might encounter bias of that type.
Mm.
Right? So you can perform being more well off than you are in order to stay safe in a certain kind of interaction.
There is an interesting paradox that happens, especially in places like the Bay Area, where it is a prerogative of white, well-compensated cis men to dress in completely, I'm going to use the old-fashioned word louche fashion, where you're dressed like an adolescent slacker, and that is the corporate uniform.
Yeah.
And it's a reverse status symbol.
Yes.
That you have a secure job where you do not have to wear a coat and tie and Armani suit.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with that is that it acts as a invisible gatekeeper because you can't buy yourself into that niche.
Right.
It's a thing where social justice wise, you can read any number of articles. My favorite is Whistling Vivaldi.
Yes.
Where a black man talks about the fact that he whistles Vivaldi literally in order to perform a class and safety. And there's no way to whistle Vivaldi while you're dressed in a hoodie and sneakers.
Uh-huh.
When 20 and 30 something white men do it, it's a sign that they can. And there's no way to mimic that. Because the actual thing that's being flaunted there is white cis maleness.
Yeah.
But it's
right. It's that sort of well, it may be related to the whole thing where white cis males are often allowed to be less mature in their behavior. You know, and oh well, it was just they're allowed to get away with all kinds of amazing and really unacceptable things. And people often talk about, well, you know, he was only 35, right? As that means he's like a kid, and somehow that's okay, right?
Yeah.
But, so yeah, it is interesting. I'm writing a note. I actually also wanted to, this is actually more on the previous topic that we were talking about where everybody was fighting over the check, but I wanted to kind of talk about what the role of a host is. You know, so if you have people, if you invite people out, what is the expectation as far as your financial responsibility for the people that you've invited out, right? If you have people staying with you, are you expected to take them out and buy them anything they want? Or, you know, where do the borderlines lie? What are you expected to provide as a host?
Right. There's a whole conflict that is really awkward to navigate for. It's somebody's birthday party. And who pays? Because there was a time in my life when birthday party meant everybody would go out and then we would divide the honorees portion of the meal amongst the celebrants.
Yeah.
And then there was, well, does the honoree's partner also get included in that? Or does the honoree's partner need to divvy in a certain percentage? And then there were other cultures simultaneously in play where, well, you invited everybody out, so you need to pay for everybody.
Right.
And then, no, everybody should just pay for themselves. And then, no, everybody should divide everything up evenly.
Well, you know, so this is yes, all of the above, right? And there's that question of, well, we've all enjoyed a meal together. Do we divide it equally, or did somebody have 6 glasses of wine? Right? Is it a thing where we should all pay the same amount, or is it a thing where we should each pay for the things that we individually consumed? And that comes up quite often, right?
Going back into manners, there's this whole thing about, do you restrain what you are ordering in a big group to try to match it up with what everybody else is ordering? Or do you just decide you're going to have what you want?
Do that. And if you know answer is you pay for what you bought, and I'm not paying for your crap.
But I've been told off. Like, so as a kid, I was taken out for dinner for my birthday. Mm-hmm. But when I wanted to eat something that my parents thought was too expensive from the menu, I got told off, and I was told I wasn't able to have that. No, you can't have that. That's impolite to your grandma who's treating you to dinner. I'm like, okay. I don't remember how old I was at the time. Probably like 8 or 9. And just barely putting my foot into this arena, right? Going, what? Okay. All right. I guess I'll have something else.
But if you know what the rules are that are in play before you order, if you know at that time, I'm going to be paying for what I order, then you can order what you want. If you know that it's going to be an even divide,
come here, Holly.
Regardless, you can make a decision based on that.
Usually people manage that by no longer going out to dinner with the people who take advantage of that in ugly ways.
Yeah.
But, there's always the first time.
Excuse me while I expel my cat. This is causing trouble.
There's also the method of people who want to get it down correctly to the exact penny, but their math skills are bad.
Yes.
And this is why smartphones are not a luxury. Also, tipping apps.
I've seen several check division apps.
Tipping apps are.
Oh man, arguments about how much to tip.
Oh my goodness, that is very complicated.
Also, the one about the uncle who grabbed the check, but he's a notoriously bad tipper.
Yes.
And then the stories about leaving cash on the table to compensate the waitstaff because you felt so bad about the terrible tip that the uncle left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then somebody else saw you leave the money, so they grab it and bring it back to you, and all the backing and forthing that goes on there. Ugh. I think there's an entire play to be written about this.
Yeah.
I mean, Douglas Adams talked about bistro math. But
sometimes, sorry, go ahead.
I think on top of just the math, there's the whole social dynamics of that.
Yeah. I mean, I really think that this is a story waiting to happen, or like 20 stories waiting to happen where tables and table manners, but not even just like how you behave at the table, but how everybody ends up being a critical element of a story somehow.
If you read immigrant narratives, we talk about this all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's about how we navigate the collision of our cultures. Yeah. And it's often that you took your partner to visit your parents moment.
Yeah.
And having to coach them through that. Mm. And also related to this is, hostess gifts and host gifts.
Oh my goodness, yes.
And then the whole culture of reciprocity.
Yes.
And escalation. And exactly how much do you escalate?
Yes.
And oh my God, I really can't afford this escalation war. How do I make it stop?
Yeah.
Oh, did you get Sally disconnected?
Sally dropped out before. She did say that she might have to reboot, so I'm not sure what happened there, but
oh, she's having trouble getting back in, I guess. I don't know. I'm sorry. I just
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I think a lot of it, I mean, it's a lot of it depends on the social context of each individual involved. Because we had a birthday party for my son, and the people who were invited were all teenagers, right? Except for my brother and his family. But because everybody was basically pretty uniformly not in a position to be guaranteed to have the money to pay for it, we were like, well, we're going to pay for it, right?
Yeah.
There were some people in the group who were surprised, right?
How old is your son?
15. So, you know, so there was some ambiguity there already. But we were like, okay, well, you know, this was our plan. We're inviting everybody out to, we went to the climbing gym. So we were like, well, we can't expect everybody to pay for the climbing gym and then pay for the dinner. So, you know, that's the way it is. But yeah.
Living in a community where there's a lot of socioeconomic disparity, there's an interesting level of what is to be expected and what not. And some people do explicitly write our treat.
Right.
So that there isn't this kind of uncomfortable ambiguity, because a lot of times you'll end up with kids who won't even accept the invitation because they have assumptions.
Yeah, that's true.
So
yeah, the phrasing, we would like to take you to dinner rather than please join us for dinner. And it's still can be very subtle.
Yeah, I think there are phrasings that can be used that people don't necessarily use by standard. And now I'm among the many projects that I have in percolation. One is a socially just etiquette guide. For, first of all, not doing things like, no, where are you from, really?
No, really.
Yeah, really.
No, really. Yeah.
No, but really, but also for things like, how do you handle this? Because again, one of the conversations in that poverty panel was about a claim that if you couldn't have a friendship across that class divide, because there could not be any real reciprocity. And those of us that I was in the audience sitting with were all people who had experienced a certain amount of rather severe class disparity on the pointy end. And we all kind of went, I have rich friends. What are they talking about?
Yeah.
And it depends upon people either not seeing the money as a token in the friendship that needs to be kept track of at all.
Right.
Or allowing for an equivalence of things other than money to the money.
Right.
You know, oh, yes, I paid for the dinner, but you had me over to your place. Or I paid for dinner, but you paid for lunch. Or I paid for dinner, but you brought sandwiches. Or you came and cleaned up my house. And it all gets kind of sticky once you start using service.
Yeah.
But there are ways to handle it.
Yeah. But, you know, also requiring financial equity across a relationship doesn't allow for changes in status. So, you know, a friend that I've had since childhood who, you know, I'm married to a man who has had the same job for several years, and God willing will continue to have the same decent paying job and be able to do things like take us out to dinner. And yet this longtime friend of mine has been in and out of jobs for his career is kind of rocky. He's been in and out of jobs for years. And so sometimes he's flush and he can take care of his family. And sometimes he can't. And so, you know, when we know that he's not in a good position, he's still my friend. He's still our friend. And we're not going to say, no, we're not going to spend time with you in the rare occasions that we have to spend time with you because you can't pay for dinner. And somehow we're going to convince you that you can accept this you can accept us paying for your dinner because otherwise we don't get to spend time together, and that's not acceptable.
Yeah.
And because I've known him such a long time, we can just do that. But it took time to get there because he's not comfortable not being able to do that.
Right. Well, this brings us to something that which I think is very interesting, which is that at least in America, what you do for a living is extremely central to your identity, particularly if you're male.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I couldn't speak to how it works across cultures, subcultures within the United States, but I've noticed it a lot in, mainstream white culture. But so it's a very strong thing. And one of the, prime examples of that is the guy who retires and can't cope because his whole self-definition was wrapped up in work and what he did for a living and how much money he earned and all this kind of stuff. And then things change, and then what do you do? Right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I guess that is a thing.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So, yeah, it's interesting. There are subcultures that are much more used to people having fluctuations in their relative prosperity, and so the sort of subtle coding and jockeying and awareness that goes around, oh, Joe's going to be short this month, and how that all gets handled is done
Right.
with varying levels of subtlety and grace, but
yeah.
There's certainly currently a cultural shift we're having trouble with, where a lot of our etiquette is, at least the most publicized etiquette, that sort of middle class cishet white thing, is that we expect that people are employed and that they have a certain amount of comfort and that it's consistent.
Yeah.
And that the changes are dramatic and noted.
Yeah.
And there are all sorts of stories that are told about how people will try to conceal that for a long time because it's just so traumatic to have to deal with it. But there are other cultures where it's just standard, musicians. Did you get a gig recently or not? Groups of writers who all expect everybody's poor. And the occasional splurge of, hey, and I'm not saying most writers do this, but I hear consultants do this. Oh, I just got a big gig. I'm happy to treat everybody. Everybody's been floating me for a long time. It's time for me to pay back. So
yeah,
I think that we're currently in the U.S. in a period of having to be in transition between a world where talking about money was very impolite to being in a world where we have to talk about money because otherwise we can't be considerate. As a world building thing, it's kind of interesting. A lot of science fiction doesn't necessarily deal with class. I find it interesting to look at how Lois Bujold has been dealing with it, because there is quite a lot of that going on. Also in the difference between class and prosperity.
Yeah.
And but also talking about what's expected and being the kid who gets invited to a house with 1 million servants, and what do you do?
Right.
I mean, my general answer is go read Miss Manners, but that's assuming a speed of being able to read and retain that is perhaps ableist.
Accessibility of,
Well, and if you're talking about fiction, is there Miss Manners, right?
Mm.
And who might that person be? What is the position of that person that allows that person to be the Miss Manners of whatever this place is?
So the existence of a Miss Manners assumes a culture that has a contingent of the population that is willing to pay for the labor of somebody who will explain this.
Mm-hmm.
And that it will be allowed to be explained. And that the people involved can explain, and that these are learnable, modelable things. I don't think there was a Miss Manners guide to the etiquette of the court of King Louis, right?
Right.
So
Did not know it, you did not belong.
Well, I mean, there are all kinds of stories about people who are pretending to fortunes that are not theirs, or to manners that are not appropriate to their station, as it were. I mean, I'm thinking of Miss Malaprop in this play by this Irish playwright. Can't remember the name of it. I'm trying to see if I have it here on my shelf. Doesn't matter. But the origin for the word malapropism, right? Somebody who is using words incorrectly, but trying to sound erudite. And there also is it even shows up in like the Canterbury Tales, where you have one of the people who's going on the pilgrimage, who is a nun, and she has these very precise table manners, and she speaks French, but she speaks it in the way that they spoke French at the convent, which is nothing like the way they speak it in Paris. And so Chaucer actually makes a point of pointing that out, which I think is kind of interesting, because it's sort of, making fun of the nun's desire to have these proper manners that would make her look like she was of a higher class than she actually is. So, and actually, now that I've mentioned the Canterbury Tales, there's actually a really interesting sort of financial deal that goes on in the Canterbury Tales, that all of the different people who are going to Canterbury are wealthy to different extents, right? And some of them are quite poor, and some of them are quite wealthy. But they make this agreement with the host at the inn where they start out. And basically, it's The Rivals. Thank you, Morgan. The Rivals by Richard Sheridan. Yes. That's where Mrs. Malaprop comes from, and I was just blanking on it.
Google is my friend.
Yay, Google. Anyway, so you've got all these different people going, and they make this bet, essentially. They make this deal that everybody's going to tell a story. And if they don't tell a story, there are financial penalties, right? So the people who are going on the trip are not expected to pay for everybody else along the way, except if they fail to tell the story that they're required to tell. So, there are interesting ways to fold this stuff into a story, right?
Well, there's that infamous, if you look at your cell phone, you have to pay the bill for everybody game.
Oh.
During dinner?
That one enrages me, because I understand why the rule exists, but some of us are on call.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us are only at dinner because our children are being watched by somebody else.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The ability to not look at your phone at all during dinner implies certain advantages or
The
conditions
state
that
of life is
yeah.
is the default, and everybody else should be living like that.
Yeah, possible emergencies and all that kind of thing.
I mean, I've just talked about parenting, but I've been to dinner with people who are caretakers for their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are all sorts of reasons for people to pay attention to their phones.
Yeah.
But the forfeits game is fun when everybody can afford it and everybody's on a par.
Yeah.
Par is important. I've been thinking of the he dined out on that story for a long time, which is probably comes from that whole tell a story or bias.
Maybe.
Pay your way.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because it places value on the telling of stories, a value that is not always appreciated.
Indeed.
It's been a time-honored position amongst many cultures to have the storyteller come through, and this is why we have the stories about itinerant storytellers
Yep.
and how you end up having court jesters and other people. We keep claiming that the idea of paying for emotional labor is a new thing, but if you look at it right, we've actually been doing this for a very long time.
Yeah.
We just stopped doing it when we only looked at Puritan rules for what was worth money.
Right.
And in fact, it is a very Puritan rule. There are lots of cultures around the world, but it's not just a white Western concept to say that only valuable goods are money. But there is a certain large amount of that. And there was also we've talked about cultures where the elders are expected to pay. And then there are cultures where elders are expected to be able to coast because they're there providing wisdom. And so there's supposed to be a class of young people in the middle who are bringing in the money. Yeah. And they're supposed to be doing the paying. And so I think that as a world building issue, it's really interesting to play with all this because it really says something about the cultural expectations of your world.
Yeah. But that
who's
also,
paying and why?
At what point do you become an elder? At what point do you become, do you switch from one expectation to another? And that also implies a stable system that doesn't clash with any other system. And a whole lot of what we find is border conditions, whether it's border from one culture to another or border from one class to another.
Well, a lot of those things are negotiated in real time. I mean, right?
I feel like that's a code switching issue.
In what way?
I mean, so there's two ways that there's a border, right? One of which is that one is interacting with different sets of people. And the other is that one has chronologically or economically gone from one status to another.
Mm-hmm.
So for one, the person who's doing the transition between groups is normally aware of that happening. And whether they do it well or badly, it's just a thing that you know that you have to do.
Yeah.
Or are told you have to do. And in the other case, it sort of depends upon the agreed upon norms of that culture, right? A lot of times when it's family hierarchy, it's simply because the generation before you has died. And so now you are the eldest. And then you and the next, cohort that's relatively the same age as you gets included. And if somebody is the youngest sibling in a run of 5, you may theoretically just be considered a different generation.
Yeah.
And whether you are or not is a whole nother complication, but usually there's rough rules for that.
Yeah.
Silently
and then
agreed
there's this
upon.
other thing. So tell me if you guys have run into this one where, at least in my family, when somebody is coming and staying at your house from your family, you're kind of hosting them and feeding them meals. And my parents will say, well, I want to take you guys out to dinner at least once while we're here because you're hosting us. Is that something that you've run across?
Oh, yeah. All the time.
So, we got older and we were like, oh, well, when my parents are hosting us, now that we're fully grown adults with incomes and things, we should probably try to take them out to dinner, right? It wasn't always a possibility.
Right.
But at the same time, there was that kind of, well, we should at least try to, take them out or whatever it is, right?
My mom also, when people come and stay, she buys tons of food to feed them.
Yeah.
So that they don't have to buy anything. And I'm always just sort of rolling my eyes with like, let them buy their own stuff.
Yeah.
But she does. She's like, my aunt was just here, and she made sure that there was always like food, and so like technically my aunt really didn't have to buy much, but my aunt also took us out to lunch. As well. So.
Yeah, in my family, we have to plan ahead for, okay, so-and-so is coming, and they will want to pay for at least one lunch, and they will want to buy something for the house. So we have to work that in as subtly as we can to the schedule. Okay, let's see. All right, it'll Tuesday. Tuesday we can go out to lunch, and we'll be slow enough with the check. We'll let her get it, and it'll make her so much happier.
Yeah. These are the things.
I just watched a friend go out to an extended away weekend with her relatively new partner's family and her relatively new partner's extended family, which was even more complicated. And allegedly, everybody was buying their own food, but then some people thought the food was communal. And then so she didn't get to have things that she'd brought because she knew she was going to be feeling anxious and picky. And then there was a question of everybody goes out to eat and which restaurants should they choose. And there was a big thing when I was dating somebody who was, I had a very long partnership with somebody from the Midwest, and the things they wanted to eat and the things I wanted to eat were in such clash.
Oh, yeah.
And so because they were paying for us, I didn't get a vote.
Yeah.
And so I ate a lot of food just because I needed calories.
Yeah.
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 So that the question of how do you get people to let you pay for things they need, but they don't want to let you pay for it because they feel like they should be paying their own way. And that's, I want to say it's easier if you're dealing with your own kids, but it isn't necessarily.
Yeah.
Because, I'm trying to explain, you have no income, so you need to let me pay for this thing that will make it possible for you to put yourself in a position where you will have an income, rather than scrabbling at something that is not an investment. Let me make an investment in your education so that you can take care of yourself instead of worrying about me, the little things that I'm buying for you.
So 2 things underlie that. One of which is there needs to be an established trust that letting somebody pay doesn't mean strings.
Yeah.
In really uncomfortable ways. And the other is that really it's a question of, I have a friend who used to lend other friends money by saying, and this was while they were still prosperous. I don't know if they're still in that state anymore, but they would say, please don't pay me back until you've cleared up all of your other interest-bearing debts. because this is because I can afford this, you can't. And hold on just a moment.
Parenting.
Yep, it's a thing.
It is a thing.
Yeah, well, we're about done, so I'm gonna let Kat finish her point when she gets back, but then we're gonna wrap it up.
I think she's right about the trust element. Is that
Yeah, absolutely.
they need to know, and my kids trust me.
Mm-hmm.
It still makes them uncomfortable.
Yeah,
It is. So the other thing was my friend would say, don't pay me back until you've paid off all of your interest-bearing loans. Because, he's like, I don't want your other debt to become more of a factor because you paid me back. So
interesting. It's an interesting idea.
It's a lovely thing. And the other thing was just that having watched other people do this is to say, look, you're uncomfortable with this, that's fine. If it feels better for you to think of this as me investing in your future, let's go ahead and write up terms. And I'm going to do this as a gamble that it will help you do better later.
Yeah.
You can either go to the bank or you can come to me. I'm going to give you better terms, which is what I've seen happen in many families. Is a whole system of saying, I'm going to cushion you so that you can handle this, which often formalize. For some people, making it less formal is more comfortable, and for other people, making it more formal is more comfortable.
Well, I mean, we didn't even start to get into so many things. There's so many things that we didn't get into, but yes.
There's like this, the Japanese don't do this that I know of, but my Chinese friends have this whole thing where they are part of a communal money pooling system where everybody kicks in a certain amount and then somebody's allowed to have that whole pool for a certain amount of time. And then they're expected to pass it back out. And then it goes on to the next person. And so there are ways of handling capital needs in ways that are not part of mainstream Western middle class, sort of the culture that certain anthropologists and sociologists now are calling weird, white, educated. I don't remember what I is. Rich and something else. You can look up the acronym somewhere, but it's talking about the fact that in psych studies, there's an assumption of what a baseline human being is because they were using undergrads.
Yes.
But yeah, there are many, many, many ways of handling these sorts of things, and they're all fascinating. And I'm sorry that between the rough throat and the other distractions, I didn't bring up as many of them as I'd hoped to.
No, you know what? It's okay because we never have enough time to talk about all the things.
Yeah.
When I got married, we were really worried about having to negotiate piece by piece through the whole thing. And my dad was really very sensible, and he gave us a budget. He was like, this is your budget. I don't care what you do within that, but that's what it is. And so what that did was it kept us from having to have multiple constant negotiations about small details of the wedding and trying to, get through these. Oh, thank you so much, Janelle. And trying to get through these, sort of constant negotiations, that we eliminated that part in favor of, here, you guys make the wedding that you want. This is what you have to do with, kind of thing. So
generosity or control generalized as control there. Wow, let's try this one more time. Control disguised as generosity versus actual generosity.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I think guidance and control are different.
Yes.
as well.
Well,
We can totally get into that later.
mm,
But at
Yeah.
this moment, I think I should draw the hangout to a close. We did get a late start, so I'm glad you all were able to stay for a few extra minutes. Thank you so much. We're going to meet again next week. I'm still negotiating some things with people about guests and such. I know I'd like to have Kate on the show to talk about public health, and
ooh,
so, you know, we're going to have some really cool topics coming up.
okay.
But I don't have them quite tied down yet. So I will update you with that as soon as I know. And for the moment, I will stop the broadcast.